Hi everyone, welcome to Type Talks. Today I'm here with Dr. John Beebe, and he is the father of the 8 function model, 4 sides of the mind. He is someone who's contributed a lot of great things to the type community. He has pioneered a lot of concepts, including the cognitive functions in the type space. He's plenty amazing. John Beebe is the author of the book Energies and Patterns in Psychological Type. I was wondering if perhaps we could go through the 8 function model a little bit to explain it briefly to people or in whatever depth you'd like. And I'm going to pull up an image actually so that it helps people with comprehension.
Let me help the people with a visual image
Yeah.
from my childhood that probably explains the way my mind works more than I know. And I'm not an introverted intuitive, so I don't usually get images, but in the way that I think some would. But when I was about 11 or 12, I was living in Princeton, New Jersey, where the Princeton University is, and I was attending. Actually, it was the first integrated school of Black and white students in New Jersey, and the our principal in the public Princeton Public School was Mr. Waxwood, who was an African American man, and I was in a rather wonderful atmosphere. And I even once saw Albert Einstein walk down the street. My mother said we were driving in the car. She said Einstein, and I looked, and there was this man walking down the street, and it was obviously Einstein. And oh my God, he actually had an aura. And so I was in a place, the Institute for Advanced Study was there, he was there. So I was in a place, my mother was working for the Educational Testing Service, which happened to be the people who first published the MBTI long ago and helped it get approved as a test for this vote. So I was in a place where consciousness was already emerging, and I had a very friendly atmosphere toward the development of the mind. And there would be things that would come my way. And one of them was the kind of thing that, gosh knows where we picked it up. Maybe it was on a trip to the New Jersey shore where there have many kinds of tourist and gift shops in the smaller uh, seacoast areas that we would go, my mother and I, when I was 11 or 12. But there was an Indian world calendar, and it was made of brass, and it was a couple of concentric circles, and it was so cleverly made that if you chose the year and the month and date, there was a circular, the circle would be such that you could find out any date and day for the next 200 years. And somehow the idea of two circles moving that gave you an answer must have been in my mind as I was starting to finally put together all these observations about the types, because what I've ended up doing in what's called the 8 function, it's really the 8 function, 8 archetype model. And what I've really, Jung, in a sense, created the 8 function model because he does name, finally, in psychological types, he refers to 8 function types. But he understands that although we have 4 functions, they can appear in either extroverted or introverted aspects. So that means that the 8 function types are extroverted thinking, introverted thinking, extroverted feeling, introverted feeling. I've just named 4 that he called rational function types. And the other function types are introverted sensation, extroverted sensation, introverted intuition, extroverted intuition. Now, these days we codify these things by capitalizing T, F, S, and N to represent thinking, sensation, feeling, and intuition. We use N for intuition because we don't want to say I, because we're saving that for the subscript. And the subscript is usually placed in a as either E or I to suggest that it's extroverted or introverted. These have been around really since Jung's own book, which is now 100 years old in its English translation, and it was already available in 1921 in Germany, in German language, and in Switzerland, where it was published. So um, the eight function types have already been named, but to that, what I added was another circle, which are eight archetypes, which represent positions in the psyche in which the types can appear. So try to imagine two concentric circles. So there's no attempt on my part to reduce any of the types to archetypes or any of the archetypes to types. What I'm trying to say is that the function types, and really a function type consists of both an attitude, which is extroversion or introversion, best used as an adjective, extroverted or introverted, and as a subscript, and a function, which is deserving of capitals because a function is feeling, sensation, thinking, intuition. These are very broad ways of orienting to the world that Jung describes. We need a function that tells us that something is sensation. We need a function that gives it a name, that's thinking. We need a function that establishes its value, that's feeling. And we need a function that tells us where it's going, what can be done with it, what will come of it, where will it go? That's intuition. He says it there that way, very glibly, as if he just thought it up that way. It actually was something he earned his way to over years of observation. When he started, there were just two types. That was around 1904, and he was already influenced by Binet, who had already come up with we know his name as the creator of what's now called the Stanford Binet intelligence test. He was a great French psychologist of intelligence. And he had already had twin daughters who were so different in their learning styles that he called one used, he said, externospection, and the other used introspection. Well, it's not hard to see. Jung had read Binet. In fact, he tried to work in Binet's laboratory, and Binet didn't want to have Jung there. He didn't think his technology was that good. And so Jung settled for Janet, who was also in Paris, who was the most famous psychotherapist in Central Europe around that time. So Jung had a great education, but he borrowed quite a bit from Binet to get to introversion and extroversion. But adding that version rather than spection, that's that turn toward, is specifically Jung. So he had down two types, and one was thinking, which had to be introverted, and one was feeling, which had to be extroverted. It was only much, much later that he got into the idea that in addition to these two rational functions that could be assigned to his image at that time, that consciousness was always rational, that there was such a thing as irrational consciousness. And so he could add to that uh, the other two functions, which were sensation, which is pretty much the thing that takes in that something is at all, and notes its isness and the qualities of its isness. And then finally, intuition, which is that function that for a long time Jung confused with the unconscious itself, but actually is an irrational consciousness, not just an unconscious something, but actually, of course, I'm so grateful he did that because he saved me from being described as just manic or insane or something, because I use extroverted intuition all the time. I'm constantly envisioning things and then making them real if I can with my inferior sensation as a kind of life task to kind of balance myself by actually making good on my intuitions. And one of those intuitions was that there was something about type that could be developed. But even as a child, I was looking for some kind of model. And I think that calendar, which was partly under the spell of my identification with my introverted, intuitive mother, I'm sure she had a role in my choosing that and supported me in getting it. So I had a kind of head start from her in the intuitive direction, but though from an introverted aspect. But in any case, That image of two circles is in my model because the types are one thing and the archetypes are another. So the function types are just as I named them. They're both functions and attitudes, and they're functions, but used in very specific ways. So that is, each function can be used either in an introverted or extroverted way. So 2 times 4 equals 8. That's one 8 function attitude model. But around that are 8 archetypes. And any of those 8 function attitudes can theoretically turn up in a different archetypal position. So when you're doing this and trying to learn my model, try to think of 2 circles rather than one. It's quite complex, and it could lead to basically 64 different positions. Actually, there are certain rules of type that make it a little simpler than that. And for the most part, we can get by with 16 for reasons that you can explain if you know type better. But basically, you have to learn 2 different models, one for the archetypes and one for the types. And notice that although Jung separates these concepts, complex, type, and archetype, I'm saying that as they manifest, everything that manifests psychologically as a consciousness is at the same time a type, a complex, and an archetype. Now, complexes is the bigger word. Jung tried to call his work complex psychology, and in a sense, the types are type complexes, and the archetypes are simply the ultimate transpersonal core of complexes. So, in a way, what we're talking about are complexes, but complexes are more complex than even the word complex will let them be. So, these days, people are talking about complexity. And complexes are where there's a nest of complexes arranging themselves in different ways, rather the way the brilliant particles that make up the electron, the electrons and the protons and the every other on they have now that make up matter. So it is with the psyche; these different parts come together. So what I've worked out is a model that will enable one to see a figure in a dream and say both what type is it and also what archetype is it, and what is the nature of its consciousness? Is it a consciousness that's well differentiated and therefore it could be called either ego consciousness or at least the consciousness that's available to the ego syntonic self or that we're conscious of? Or is it really an unwanted, unrealized, and in that sense, still very shadowy complex? So there's plenty of room once we have the mapping of where the types are and where the archetypes are and how they coincide. Jung calls this a coincidentia oppositorum because in many ways type and archetype are opposites, but they're coincidentally connected in an actual expression. A moment of consciousness is a kind of miracle. And it's a miracle when it occurs in a dream. It's a miracle when it occurs in waking waking light, a good slip. It's a sudden illumination, and it's a bit of a shock. And a lot of things have to come together, just like a lot of things had to come together for there to be a big bang. So too, a lot of things have to come together for a human being to become conscious. But become conscious human beings do. So we take apart the different parts of it, but actually we're looking at not one easy set of complexes, but a genuine complexity that allows us to take that fundamental property of matter, which is irritability of living matter, and that amazing reactivity we all have, and actually turn it into an actual consciousness that's differentiated along lines that turn out to be, I think, if we study closely, exactly as Jung said. There really are thinking kinds of consciousness, and there's feeling kinds of consciousness, and there's sensation kinds of consciousness, and there's intuitive kinds of consciousness. And those can appear in introverted, meaning ways in which we check them back out against something inside. And I think that something inside is the archetypes. Or we move them out into the world and we check them against our actual experience of people and environments and things outside ourselves. That's the big difference between introversion and extroversion. It's how they construct experience. There's a wonderful book called The Experience of Introversion, which is by a couple of men. One is a phenomenologist and one is a personologist. And that book, their names are Shapiro is the phenomenologist, and Alexander is the personologist. And Alexander and Shapiro put together this book published in 1975. And they say the real difference between extroversion and introversion is that experience is constructed differently. Extroversion always involves a sharing with someone else, so that just it's almost, imagine it's a person, but it could also be an environment. For instance, a skier shares his skiing with the mountain he's skiing on if he's extroverted, whereas the introverted skier can't really share the experience, loves the experience, but what they're really doing while they're skiing is seeing if it matches up to some kind of archetypal image of what skiing is that probably goes back thousands and thousands of years. People have been climbing mountains and skiing on them for a very long time, and it's built up in some way that we don't fully understand. An archetypal sense of this is skiing. So the introvert who goes to a ski resort and it all works says this is skiing. If the resort doesn't work, they say, well, I did all that, but it wasn't skiing. Well, how do they say that? They're checking against an archetype they already have, an a priori sense of what it is. Whereas the extrovert is really seeing how other people are enjoying the party, imitating others, seeing how they all work together, see how the meals work and the time on the schedules and everything. And they're completely merging, not retreating to a private checking system of the archetypes. They're merging with the actual experience. And if the merger is satisfactory, they have had a satisfactory experience. They've constructed the experience that way. So think of that happening for all of the functions Jung talks about. Each of them becomes a function type only if it's a function of consciousness also used in either an introverted or an extroverted way. And think of the fact that all of us have introverted and extroverted types of consciousness. And then let's add to this that some of these are rational types, like thinking and feeling. It's the way I feel. That's my judgment, or it's what I name it. It's what I call it. That's my logic. That's my thinking. That's all rational. Jung had a bad fight on his hands to call feeling rational, but it is. The example I always give to say is feeling rational. It's when a husband and wife, let's say he's got extroverted thinking and she's got extroverted feeling, and so they're planning their party. It's a dinner party, and they're going to invite people from the office, and he's in a corporation, and he wants to have. So he has the idea. Now we want to mix the couples up. So let's just let's do it this way. Let's just put everybody in alphabetical order. If they're put in alphabetical order, we'll just put and then nobody can say we've been arbitrary. Everybody has the same chance. And then his wife, who's got extroverted feelings, says yes. And if you do that, your boss's wife will be sitting next to your boss's mistress. And I don't think that's a very good idea for a party. So obviously she using extroverted feeling, but he's saying, well, you're not being rational. Well, actually what she's not being is logical. But she is being rational. Rationally, it is possible for someone with feeling to say that they shouldn't sit next to each other. It just isn't a good idea. And that's not an intuition or a sensation. It's a bit of reason, but it's feeling reason. And so thinking reason uses logic. Feeling reason uses values and emotional effects and so forth to guide it. Each of those is rational. Well, half of our consciousness is rational and half of our arguments are rational. But what about all the other arguments, like the one I had with my mother? I'm a film buff, and even at she took me to the movies all the time, and it worked. I became a film buff. Well, I wanted to go in 1954 to the opening of A Star Is Born with Judy Garland and James Mason. It was the most talked about movie in America of that year, and I wanted to be there. And I said, well, my mother was going to go with me, and I said that'd be great. Let's go on opening day. And she said, my mother being an introvert and also being a little bit jealous of the fact that I seemed to be liking Judy Garland better than her at that moment. And so she said, well, we'll go when the crowd's thin. So we did go in the crowds then, 15 days later. Well, the movie opened up. Time magazine said it was the greatest one-woman show in history. It was got fabulous reviews and so forth. But the distributors were upset because it was a long film. So 5 days after it opened, they cut the film and they took out something like 30 minutes of the screen time. Uh, and that became one of the great tragedies stories in history. Judy Garland didn't get the Academy Award. The film didn't make as much sense with the 30 minutes lost. And I never forgave my mother, because if I had gone as my extroverted intuition told me to do on opening day, I would be one of the very few people who had actually seen the uncut Star Is Born. Many years later, someone managed to piece together most of the pieces, but still some dramatic scenes were missing. And I saw the restored Star Is Born, and that was a wonderful experience. But it wasn't the experience it would have been in 1954 if my extroverted intuition had had the way. Now, that's totally irrational. Um, and so, with that battle between my mother's form of my extroverted irrationality and mine, hers was, I had a kind of a mania. She had kind of a depression about going out and doing things. And so we would have these battles, even though we were both intuitive types. I couldn't hardly explain what that would even matter to a sensation type, because going to a movie isn't that big a deal, except that who knew in 1954 that a thing called film studies, in which movies like that would suddenly be preserved and studied and discussed all over the world, was coming. I did, however, and I use film all the time to verify types, because it works so well. It proves that if it's that accurate in movies, there must be something to it. Because believe me, the filmmakers didn't have time to read Jung, and Jung, as far as we know, only saw one movie his entire life. So that's so. I'm trying to give you the idea that there's other kinds of consciousness than just thinking and feeling, and that's what Jung had to come to. And there's also sensation. The people cut the film because it was expensive to have too few showings a day. And that was something Judy Garland and her husband and the producers of the film didn't take into account. And the sensation aspect, the money aspect, how much you can make has a lot to do with what happens to a film or anything else. And of course, neither my mother nor I knew anything about that. We only knew that one of us wanted to go on opening day and the other wanted to go when the crowds thinned. And that would be a classic extroverted, introverted thing. So here we have these type differences that show up in every person, every family. What I wouldn't have been able to touch until 1970s, when I began to look at my own dreams and try to find the types in the dreams, is that every type has an archetypal presentation as well as a type presentation in the actual phenomenology. It's much clearer in dreams as it is in movies than it is in waking life. But my wanting to go on opening day was heroic. And from my point of view, my mother's not wanting to go on opening day was oppositional. Now, whether my mother was really being oppositional or just an introvert, I can't really say. I think it was a bit of both. But My mother was using oppositional extroverted intuition in envisioning what it would be like to go there. And I was using heroic, no matter what it is, I'm going kind of extroverted intuition. And she was avoiding going on opening day. I was diving into going. I happened to have been right in on that particular occasion. And I think for me, my mother's way of using extroverted intuition became very annoying because it crimped my style. And so we would have battles. I wasn't really battling with her introverted intuition. I was battling her way of using extroverted intuition, which is mine. So that gets into the qualitative aspect, not just how much of the energy, which would be our original type models, are quantitative in the sense that we call the dominant function the most energized function, and we usually call the auxiliary function the second most, and the others. It sort of breaks down when we get to the others, but there's a quantitative aspect, and the MBTI is measured, so it's all quantitative. But when you add in the archetype that's carrying the function, the other circle, that archetypal circle around just the 8 functions, then the qualities come forward. And it's the qualities of the functions that are picked up by the archetypes. And uh, my hero and my mother had a lot of investment in what I did with my life. But when I would live it heroically, pick up the ball she tossed me and try to be a hero, she would get very frightened. There was something in her, she being an introvert intuitive, had rather oppositional extroverted intuition. And oppositional extroverted anything takes 4 faces that I've found. One is to be avoidant, one is to be passive aggressive, and my mother could do those things. One could be seductive. She could also be very seductive. And the fourth, I'm sorry to say, could be paranoid, and she could be that too. And through her, I learned to recognize the opposing personality early on, because she both shaped me and then tried to inhibit me. And then there was this battle royal between my extroverted use of intuition and her introverted. Now, in my family, my parents divorced early, and I clearly chose my mother over my father. My father was an extroverted thinking type, and he was a rational type. And I found both my mother and I could not stand his rationality. She, because it wasn't good feeling, and I, because it just wasn't irrational enough. He wanted to make everything rational. So we both found him difficult to deal with. And I think in our case, didn't show enough respect for what he was and who he was. I think I see more there than I wanted to see at the time. He was a military man, and he spent a lot of time in China and Japan, actually, and after the war. And oddly enough, I find myself in Asia in many of the places that he worked and did things, and I found my own way to see, he made himself fluent in Japanese and Chinese, and there's a lot of my father's extroverted thinking that actually anticipates me too. I saw myself as a mother's son, but I see in adult life how much the father was actually there, even though I tried to shove it out. And that's always the way. The irrational types are prejudiced against the rational types, and the rational types are prejudiced against the irrational types. So talk about complexity and opposites. You got introversion, extroversion, rational, irrational, on the personal level, on the archetypal level, conscious, unconscious. It's a perfect storm. And no wonder people find it hard to hold. Only most people, when they approach typology, can only hold a tiny part of it, because the entire system that Jung has is in that anticipated, and that I've really tried to follow him in completing some of the thought he left kind of dangling, but it's all there in Jung in a way. It's an astonishing intuition and thinking and sensation and finally feeling achievement of the human mind to create such a system that has such a capacity to talk about our most important and characteristic thing, which is our consciousness. The commonest symbol in dreams is the human being, other humans, and humans talking, appearing, showing up. Yes, we have animals. Yes, we have mandalas and archetypes and that are inorganic. But the commonest symbol in dreams is another human being, and another human being is represented by their consciousness. And their consciousness is being depicted for us, and we are looking at that either with welcoming arms or askance in our dreams every night. We're so threatened by a consciousness that's foreign to us, and we also get a good look at the state of our consciousness. And if it shows up that someone is using feeling in a very inappropriate way, guess who is doing that? It's us. Someone whose intuition is bad, that's us. We see images of consciousness in its various states. Not all dreams are just about what the inside of us. I have had many political dreams that have given me a sense of where the confusing world of American politics is going ahead of the time that it went that way, and they've been very extraordinary. We see consciousness and the state of it in our dreams. Jung said that our dreams show us the actual situation in the consciousness, in the unconscious. I'm anticipating myself. He says dreams show us the actual situation in the unconscious. Well, that doesn't mean in my unconscious, and he means in the unconscious. That is to say, we see the world in its unconscious state. But another way to say that is a little different, and it's one that I would prefer to say, is that we actually see in our dreams the state of consciousness, including the degree of its absence in our dreams, so that we actually see dreams that indicate how far we've gotten toward consciousness and also how far we haven't gotten. So in that sense, I would see it a little differently. I think I think it's all consciousness, but in different states of evolution. And so that makes the dream the perfect way to see the types of consciousness that Jung is talking about, because they're all growing in us and operating. So you sort of take a look at your garden, if I could give a very modest metaphor for it, in which how are the plants in your garden of consciousness growing, and their dream is your best way of showing that to you. So the model I've come up with is actually kind of cool in the way the Indian world calendar was cool, is that it gives you the personal circle of the types, function types of consciousness, the function attitudes, as we nowadays call them, and then the surrounding archetypal areas and roles in which they show up, because we use our consciousnesses in different roles. So I've named some roles: hero, father, mother, eternal child, and finally the famous anima and animus, that are contra-sexual to the sexual position of the dominant function, so that the man will have a female anima and the woman a male animus. Uh, it says classical Jung. Each of these are, in my view, archetypal positions. So it matters whether my feeling is in my anima or my sensation, and as in my case, where it really is in my anima, or whether it's in my dominant function. So I can say I have heroic extroverted intuition, but I have anima introverted sensation. And you have to know, by definition, extroverted intuition and introverted sensation are on an axis. And that axis happens to be the spine of my own personality. But I have to live with other people. I can't just be myself. I also have to take care of other people. So I have an introverted thinking, which defines whether I can even be there for other people. You and I have had the experience of that. And then we have the extroverted feeling, which is very much the child that's eager to please and take care of other people. And that's also present in me. The child is very alive in me. So they are on my horizontal axis of my relations to others. So in addition to all the other opposites, we have to think of an axis of self, an axis of others. So it's easy to diagram it if you take the self and other, because then you can make it a cross, and then you put it 4 functions, and there they are. Well, except that you can only have them in either extroverted or introverted attitudes. So yeah, you can have a cross of 4, but you're still going to have another cross of 4, which are the same functions in shadow. I've already given you that. With my mother. My mother was in shadow for me. We were together in being intuitives, but she was an introverted intuitive with inferior extroverted sensation, and I was an extroverted intuitive with inferior introverted sensation. So though when I was a baby, we were like the 2 intuitives against my rational father, when I got older and was in adolescence, we were really at each other arguing all the time because of the attitude difference. Uh, so all the opposites. So again, coincidentia oppositorum, many pairs of opposites, all coinciding. Typology is like that, and typology is a fantastic map. I'm sure that I helped create it out of I have a terrible sense of geography, and yet I've become the very geographer of typology. It's very interesting. I mean, no one else has done this much geography of typology of where things are at in one person and made sense of that. I mean, that's really what I've added. And I think it's hilarious that I, who have no sense of direction and can't even walk out of a house and think I'm going somewhere without it almost invariably being the wrong direction to go. I always go when I think I'm going somewhere, it's almost perfect that I'll go the wrong way. And I'm even in places I should know my way around, I'm still finding my way and get all mixed up in geography. Yet when I'm dealing with typology, I've created a map, and it really is a map, and I honestly think it works. So that's how the Beebe model looks to me, and that it pretty much gives you the end of the story, which is all the way down from my extroverted intuition to my so-called demonic extroverted sensation. The darkest part of my shadow is the part, I don't know, I feel like somebody who mapped out a river in Africa, and sometimes even a Magellan who sails around. But that's my fantasy of the degree to which something that is otherwise unconscious for me has been a source of added consciousness, I hope, to the understanding of type.
Wonderfully said, John Beebe. And so when he's mentioning ego syntonic, he's referencing your top 4 functions, 1 to 4. And when he says ego dystonic, he's talking about 5 to 8. And so just for people who are new and looking for a reference. And also when John is talking about the spine, he's talking about the 1st and the 4th function. And these are the related to self and identity. And then when he's talking about arms, and what you do for other people, he's talking about 2 and 3. His theory is quite amazing in that sense because it's quite nuanced in that.
That even add spine is function 1 and function 4. I don't have a perfect name for 5 to 8. It's a shadow axis. It does exist, but it's not the spine. It's like a shadow of the spine. The spine is the axis of integrity. that shadow axis can be in some of us virtually an axis of evil. Frankly, it can be the part of us that can be pure hell on wheels. There's only one spine of integrity along which our spinal cord of vital living it's in potential Tao can happen. The other one is oppositional at best and demonic at worst, so it can be quite undermining. Yeah.
That is true. It's the shadow part for sure. And so the reason why I say that John Beebe is one of the pioneers of the cognitive functions is that at the time, Keirsey, he created temperament theory, which is really great, but he was also against the functions. And so John Beebe was one of the people who advocated for the functions, and he really helped popularize it and make it a part of the vocabulary we have today.
I think I probably took the functions even more seriously than most analysts do, because everybody got caught up in introversion, extroversion, and wasn't as sharp. I just think the functions are so specific. I hated to lose that specificity.
It's true, which we're thankful for you for. And also, John Beebe made the differentiation between introversion and extroversion and how it appears in functions. And so he talked about how the introverted functions, it's almost like checking in with an archetype that they have inside. So
that I got from Alexandra and Shapiro, and I use it and teach it, and I made that more popular than they were saying to do. Yes.
Absolutely, yeah. And so I think a millennial way of putting it is memory. And I know it's most correlated with introverted sensing to call something memory, because introverted sensing is about concrete detail and memory. And so in the most classical sense, that's not all it is, but that's one of the many facets.
Well, let's stop there for a minute and stay
Yeah.
with what you just said. Everyone says introverted sensation refers to past experience
Mm-hmm.
and to orient itself. And every introverted sensation type will tell you that when they look at something, they'll remember the last time they
Mm.
something like that. But what that leaves out is something that opened me to realize since I have an introverted sensation anima, I've had a whole set of attractions to and friendships with introverted sensation people. And I think you've interviewed Adam Fry, and he's an introverted sensation type. He's also my partner, and he is a very, very good example of introverted sensation. And what I learned from Adam is that he has an uncanny ability to tell you whether something's a real thing or not. Now, God, is that God given? Because especially when you're writing theory, as I've done, to have someone who can tell you and verify, are you really talking about something real here, or his concept just? And that has helped my anima commitment to accuracy to have a friend and a tool. I've used many other things, but Adam's been enormously helpful to verify. And I've watched how he does it. And I'm convinced that the ability to figure out whether something's real or not cannot be confined to memories from the past experience in this life. I think introverted sensation has a capacity to check against the collective unconscious, against the archetypes, and figure out. It's like a jeweler working in a store who can put a bit of metal in his mouth and chew on it, and he'll tell you whether it's gold or it's a very, very skillful fake made of brass by how there's some of, and it's much more than having used your mouth several times with real and fake. It's also something uncanny. So that's where I think people sort change the introverted functions unless they realize that when they're checking against the archetypes, they're really checking against whether whatever they think this is stands the test of time. And the test of time goes back maybe 10,000 years. I mean, and they get that access. So that's where I really feel we've not understood that introverts, you check against archetypes, not and introverted sensation types don't just confine themselves to past memory. They also confine themselves to what could be called ancestral memory. we don't know enough about this. And Jung would say, well, I'm not Lamarckian, and yet he was. I mean, and also, where do animals like dogs learn how to hunt? So, there's something about ancestral memory. We just don't know enough about it yet. And we need to know more about it.
I wonder if a parallel could be drawn for the other introverted functions too. Is introverted thinking ancestral logic?
Well, yes. I mean, I use introverted thinking all the time. It's my auxiliary. And we're going to have a little riff on auxiliary versus dominant, because let's first of all say that. And with me, you always ask a question, and then I always answer another one, because that's extroverted intuition. It just hops across the stream. But allow me the indulgence of leading away to go back. The If you think of the dominant function as the one that is quantitatively strongest, but the auxiliary is quantitatively second, you're going to get in a lot of trouble, because you never know how strong a function is going to be. An inferior function could be the strongest function in a person if they have an inferiority complex, and many of us do. And some people are more oppositional than they are heroic, and so forth. My mother being one, and so you the archetype gives the function strength, and the strength cannot be predicted in advance. So these are not quantitative, but where we really get in trouble is we think of the auxiliary function like we're flying a plane, and one motor. I used to, when I was a child, I would be on two-engine planes, and if one engine should suddenly catch fire or conk out, you still have the other engine to get you home. Well, it's not like that, because the dominant function is being used to assert yourself. And fortunately, I've been blessed with an extroverted intuition that can do that. And I'm grateful that I've been given the chance, and to my mother and father for getting me to the place that, and myself to get me to the place, and my analysts and everybody who's cared for me, Adam and so forth, to enable me to be me, and people like you, Joyce, to give me the space to be me. Thank you all. But it's an assertive function. This face talks and says what it envisions. My auxiliary function, however, is something else. There, I'm not trying to assert myself as such, and I'm not really trying to even lay my theory on other people so much as I'm trying to support other people in their thinking. So my introverted thinking is about, even though it's an introverted function, is being used. When we say auxiliary to what? I'm like the auxiliary to other people. I'm trying to offer people help with their thinking. And as a therapist, and also because my mother needed someone to think for her, and I was young, I learned to do this for her. I kind of think for other people. Please don't assume I can think this way for myself. I can't. I'm very good at thinking for other people. So my theory is an attempt to explain typology to others, realizing that they find it difficult, and it's meant to be helpful, and it's my effort to help other people. So I pour a lot of my thinking energy in that direction. So it's been designed to be used by other people to help them think about type. It's not actually being used by me to conquer the world and say, listen to Bibi, that he invented type, and this is the way to do type. First of all, it's not extroverted thinking, but it isn't even really heroic in that sense. It was a labor. I was felt that I had it in me. This is how, I didn't raise children, but I raised typology, so to speak, or typological thinking in other people. So it's kind of it's fostering, and in that sense, calling me the father, that's good, because it is a father function, creative thinking. But the thinking is being used in the service of others. Now, most therapists, we assume, we're going to support feeling, and it's natural, we would expect that. But there's such a thing as thinking therapy too, and mine is a thinking addition to what therapists have. I don't mean it's the only thing I use when I see actual patients, but certainly what you've been reading of mine is my attempt to share thoughts that I think will help you think. That's what I'm doing. It's a teacher's thinking.
We're thankful for your parent TI for all of that. We oftentimes use the parent function to help other people rather than help ourselves. And on a topic switch, I was wondering what your thoughts were on the four sides of the mind, because that's something that you brought into type theory too.
Well, that's a term that's been used by the people who study my work. It isn't one I created as such. So make sure that this is where I'll admit my inferior sensation. I can be very quick and glib when I look at other people's work. So I've seen this around and could you tell me what you conceive of as the four sides of the mind?
Yeah. So it's essentially the ENTP has the INTJ, the ISFJ, and the ESFP in different states.
I see. Well, they're adding more to it than I would. I mean, I don't make four functions in each of the four places. All I really say, and what I came to the original intuition, and it came from looking at dreams, is that my dominant function is heroic, my inferior function is anima. I had that was the inferior function was associated with the anima. Animus was something Jung himself talks about as early as psychological types, but no one said any. So the people in Zurich would say the anima carries the inferior function, but no. Then I wondered, well, who carries the other functions? And so I thought of the hero and I could see the hero in myself with my extroverted intuition because I certainly am good at envisioning and opening up and exploring. My favorite thing when I was a child in Nanking, China, when I was 7 to 9 years old, my father was an assistant military attaché, was to go exploring. We'd go to the pagoda, we'd go here and there. My mother gave me a lot of freedom to roam around that city. And I've always had that extroverted, intuitive side to myself. That was very real for me. Now, the uh, but I was seeing dreams in which there would be an older man harassing a younger person. And I began to think, older or younger? What's older? What's younger? And in that way, I finally came to the idea that the auxiliary function is older in the sense of being more developed. And then the third function is less. So that's how I first saw in a dream, where it was quite a dramatic dream, but the older man was chasing a boy around the table with a butcher knife around the kitchen table. Now, I now would see this very differently than I did at the time, but I thought older and younger was where I went, and that was where I got the idea that the older is the more developed, the younger, and that gave me the second function and the third. And what I thought at the time was that the butcher knife was my tendency to try to carve everything up with separating distinctions between concepts, and I was overthinking things. And that was some part of my father that had gotten into me. And I thought of the boy as the part of myself that could be intimidating to other people and particularly bad and harassing to my feeling. And I felt that my thinking was happening at the expense of my feeling. Well, what I did was work on feeling for almost 20 years to kind of get my feeling up to speed. But as I worked it out, I now see that you often see, and I think it's Angelo Spotto has pointed this out, we often see the types in our dreams first through the shadow. And I think it's very important. So I now would say that older man with the butcher knife that's like Saturn's sickle. It has a sort of a Saturnine. It was a synex. It's the shadow side of the father, the critical father, and I did pure experience my dad that way. And then the third function would be introverted feeling, which, though it might seem like an innocent victim, could itself be quite provocative. And I now see that as trickster introverted feeling. And so there was someone in my life I associated with that. Uh, so the wounded boy stance can often be a stance of the trickster. Uh, we see it frequently that tricksters present themselves as if they were victims. And so I would now say that I saw the axis, but in its shadow aspect. But thank heaven I didn't see everything at once, and thank heaven none of us do. What I thought more innocently was it was my more developed thinking and my less developed feeling, and I had to get more balance between them. And I did. And when I did get in balance, then I could begin to see that was a dream about the shadow. And it was a dream about what can happen to someone if they don't develop their functions, is that they do live in their shadow aspects. So that one advantage of type development is that it saves you from falling into your shadow, because I was much more in my shadow at that time than I wanted to be. And I'm much less in that now that I know what it is to have helpful thinking and feeling function that can survive and take care of itself. I wasn't there at 30, but I'm certainly there at 84 by comparison. And so that's what I'm trying to tell you, that but I think that idea that, again, the opposites, but also that they're associated with each other and they can get dysfunctional, but they can also come into order. I hope that begins to answer some of what you're asking about.
Yeah, that absolutely does. And it also shines a light on how the shadow functions appear in people as well, too. Something really great that you add to typology, John, is you talk about the importance of developing your spine, in that for a lot of people, this is the fourth function, where you develop it to the point where it doesn't undermine you as a human being. And then you can become the best version of yourself.
That I call integrity in depth. It seems to me that we have a phenomenal system. And so, to all the other opposites, I'm going to add another that the Jungians love and that everybody else doesn't take quite as seriously, which is the superior function and the inferior function. That, if you think about the functions as complexes, what that means is that every one of us who has managed to evince a superior function. And it's not everyone. Some of us are still very intimidated and very afraid to be ourselves and have been oppressed or just not supported by our families. Somehow my family certainly in some way supported my developing a superior function. But you see, the trouble with that is you get a superiority complex. And others can't stand you to the degree that you do that. Then we have an inferior function, which really doesn't take training. It just doesn't. It's really amazing. It's like the scarecrow. It wants to walk, but it flops around and in the Wizard of Oz. So I love that image of the inferior function. And he's obviously got an inferiority complex because he sings "If I Only Had a Brain," and he thinks he can't think. Actually, his thinking is pretty good, but he doesn't feel it's good. Um, so that, but how wonderfully constructed we are, that we would have a superiority complex, but also an inferiority complex. So, how nice to be able to say that in some areas we are superior. There's a hexagram in the I Ching, the Chinese Book of Changes, which has the title in the Wilhelm translation. He was the German missionary who went there in 1895, right after the Boxer Rebellion, and stayed until about, let's say, 1920 or so, and published these wonderful translations of Chinese classics, including Confucius and Lao Tzu, but also amazingly the I Ching. And then he became a friend of C.G. Jung's, and he calls this hexagram 14. The Chinese word for hexagram is Gua, Gua. He calls it possession in great measure. And there is a line in it that Wilhelm's explanations of these things, where he had worked with a Chinese philosopher that he met, who was a Confucian, who was really smart about the I Ching and taught him. His name was Lao Niswan, and he really got him to see many things about how they work. But he has a line, there's a line in Possession in Great Measure where it says, the line goes, he, meaning the person, not necessarily a gendered person, just sexist language of the past, he makes a difference between himself and his neighbor, no blame. Now, Wilhelm doesn't do very well with that because he has a kind of Christian translation about it doesn't quite work about recognizing that the neighbor has more power and this and that. It's not really and being meek, but that's not what the line means. I think the line means is that when you have to give yourself credit for what you have, and if you have better something than other people, it's okay. And it isn't a source, there's no blame in it. It's not karmically sinful, if I can mix up Buddhism and Christianity for a minute, to own your strength. In other words, that superiority complex is not all bad. It's okay to say, when I have to know, and I've had to know, I'm a lot more intuitive, at least extrovertedly, than many other people. And that's enabled me to open up many things that other people wouldn't have been able to do. I have to own that. In that area, I am genuinely superior. I can make a difference between myself and my neighbor. I probably see farther in the extrovert intuitive way than other people who've worked in the area of typology. Fine. That doesn't make me emperor of the world, but I can own that distinction. So the superiority complex has its place. But thank God I was also given an inferiority complex, so that and that I own my inabilities to sometimes discriminate introverted sensation differences. And so, yes, I can have some appropriate, I don't know if it's vanity, but appropriate owning of my strength, but also some appropriate owning of my weakness. And somehow to be able to hold that tension of opposites, that's where integrity comes, because you have a sufficient amount of self-doubt to ask yourself if what you're doing is virtue or just because you're good at it, you think you can do any damn thing you want, if I may curse a little bit. You can't. It isn't right. So I think for a long time, I thought my insecurity was something I was going to be cured of in Jungian analysis. What I learned was to live my insecurity. I also learned to live with some security in the area of my strength. But to hold those in balance, I hope that has given me some integrity, because I don't think with one or the other you get to integrity. I think with one you're too ashamed, and with the other you're too proud. And you see what I'm talking about, I think. And it becomes a vital awareness that we are both strong and weak. That gives us a certain openness to learning more about how to live that contradiction. And that's where I think I've probably been pretty good at not only teaching but learning through the course of a lifetime. And I feel that I wouldn't feel that I was a very good teacher if I hadn't also been continuously learning.
Yeah, there is that paradox between the superiority complex and the inferiority complex that exists within a human being. You can even see this demonstrated in some INTPs who hyperfixate on their extroverted feeling and can identify as being very agreeable and wanting to build connection, and that's a very important thing to them. And they may not always be successful with that, but it could be where they really direct a lot of their focus or their attempts to be good at this. That's really interesting because then it allows people to not see the function stack in terms of strength or in terms of quantity, but rather in terms of more Jungian lenses, which is a more qualitative look, a more archetypical look, a look into people's complexes, their unconscious, their subconscious. So
And it
that,
really helps with second and third function too, because just as we have a function that is good at or could be good at or can be made to be good at teaching, fostering, enabling, parenting, in a sense, other people, and then that way taking care of other people. That's function number two. We also have a function, frankly, the eternal child. Well, it was the Jungian analyst in London, Michael Fordham, said better than anybody else, the business of babies is being loved. And there's a third function that wants to be loved, admired, taken care of. It's our normal narcissism, if you like. It's the normal entitlement of the child. It's the part of us that really wants to be taken care of and and help. We have both sides again on that side. One a caretaker side and one's a desire to be taken care of. So that way we don't end up using the caretaker as a kind of reaction formation to really wanting to be taken care of. We are aware of both. We're not afraid to assert our wish to be taken care of as well as to enact our ability to take care of. So I love that what I'm getting at is, yes, it's a coincidence of opposites that make the typology, but it has a structure, and the structure allows balance. The balance of opposites is a, and once that's achieved, it's almost like you've got two arms and a spine. You're doing pretty well.
that is very true. And that stays true to Jung's desire to use type for individuation. And so that you're able to get these opposites and able to find balance between them and ultimately grow yourself by not being controlled by your unconscious or subconscious and calling it fate, as Jung puts it.
Perhaps we could say self-realization in the sense of a little s self. In other words, the eight function model gives you kind of your own house. In the last couple of years, I've been showing in some of my lectures something you may have seen me show. Back in the 19th century, we had something called phrenology, phrenology, which is pretty much had the same purchase on people's imagination that typology does now, except that all they were doing was feeling the bumps in the head, and they felt from that they could deduce the personality underneath. And sometimes we do that with typology too. But in any case, the leading phrenologist in America was a man named Orson S. Fowler, Fowler. Well, Orson S. Fowler was also an amateur architect, but a really good one, so much so that he developed a peculiar structure that became incredibly popular in America in the 1850s. And there's even one in San Francisco still today. And it was the Octagon House. And this is a house that has eight sides, and his wonderful drawings show this. And this whole book is a book that he published in the middle of the 19th century. And he has elaborate floor plans for the Octagon House, and there are many different pictures of what one might look like. It usually has a turret up above with maybe four, but there, yes, you guessed it, it has eight faces. And imagine having so imagine this coming out of a man who was doing phrenology and apply it now to typology. And there we have the eight function model. It's like eight faces. And the turret on top may be the four function model that we sometimes use, but the minute you get the eight function, that's the if you've ever owned a house and tried to develop it, you don't develop every room at the same time. There's some room you just don't go into. It's not, you don't know what to do with it. And then eventually you get there. Jung has a dream that he had right after he, if I can find it, right after he had psychological types in press, he took a visit to he did one of his trips, and his trips were very important to him. He didn't take all that many, but he did go to North Africa, and he had an amazingly interesting time in North Africa. And he had a dream of being with an Arab prince, and I want to read you this dream because it's so interesting. He had this dream on his last night in North Africa. He was in, as I recall, Tunis, and he was going to take the ship back to Marseille, France, the next day. And he was struggling with what he'd experienced of the Muslim world and everything. And this is the dream he had. Now, remember, the year is 1920, and remember that the manuscript for psychological types is already in the hands of the printer. He said, I dreamed I was in an Arab city, and as in most such cities, there was a citadel or a kasbah, and the city was situated in the broad plain and had a wall all around it. The shape of the wall was square, and there were 4 gates. So, 4-gated city, very famous idea. And there we could certainly see a 4-function model. The Kasbah in the interior of the city was surrounded by a wide moat, which is not the way it really is in Arab countries, and I stood before a wooden bridge leaning over the water to a dark horseshoe-shaped portal, which was open. And eager to see the citadel from the inside also, I stepped out on the bridge. When I was about halfway across it, a handsome dark Arab of aristocratic, almost royal bearing came toward me from the gate. And I knew that this youth in the white burnous was the resident prince of the citadel. When he came up to me, he attacked me and tried to knock me down. We wrestled. In the struggle, we crashed against the railing. It gave way, and both of us fell into the moat where he tried to push my head underwater to drown me. No, I thought, this is going too far, and in turn, I pushed his head underwater, and I did so, although I felt great admiration for him, but I did not want to let myself be killed. I had no intention of killing him. I only wanted to make him unconscious and incapable of fighting. Now, I think that is the struggle with the shadow that comes when we have a 4-function model. And here, this Jung from Europe meets an Arab prince who's also civilized in another part of the world. And it brings up the problem of the shadow, which he doesn't exactly solve in the book Psychological Types. So it kind of leads, this is the struggle Jung is having. Let's go on with the dream. Then the scene of the dream changed. And I think you'll love this. And he was with me in a large vaulted octagonal room in the center of the citadel. So you see, this, I think, is Jung's first anticipation of the need for an 8-function model rather than simply a 4-function model, which is where the Jungians more or less got stuck. The room was all white, very plain and beautiful. Along the light-colored marble walls stood low divans, and before me on the floor lay an open book with black letters written in magnificent calligraphy on milky white parchment. Now, my friend Murray Stein heard this dream when I once talked about it and thought of the Red Book, but the Red Book does not look like this book that's there. This gets more to do with Jung's interest in what's an obscure, but not so obscure, religious heresy that became the first world religion, the Manichaean religion, which Mani had created. It was not Arabic script. Rather, it looked to me like the Uigurian script of West Turkestan. That would be in Xinjiang, China today, which was familiar to me from the Manichaean fragments from Turfan. Jung had seen these in the Berlin Museum. He couldn't get over them. And he couldn't get over Mani because Mani said that the shadow is always with us. And Mani said that not even God could stop the shadow from being, but he called it evil. And so the Manichaean position is that we have God and we have man, but we have to also live with good and evil. And even God has to leave that alone. For that, he got eventually declared a heretic, and he was also executed by a Persian who was not as sympathetic as the previous Persian emperor had been to the Manichaean. So it was a heresy from the standpoint of Zoroastrianism, and it was a heresy from the standpoint of Christianity. But it was one idea that you don't get rid of the shadow simply because you have consciousness and find your way to God and so forth. And I think that was the thing that Jung must have realized when he wrote Psychological Types, that his unconscious still needed to make more room for the shadow, not to let it overwhelm him. But anyway, Jung is looking at this. He said he didn't know the contents of this book in this strange script, but nevertheless, he had the feeling this was my book, that I had written it. And by the way, the Manichaean religion was in China. It was the first true world religion, and it was even practiced in China until the end of the 19th century. But he had the feeling, Jung had, that this was my book, that I had written it. And I think this is the book that I've been helping Jung to write. I feel like he left this for me to help with or to make Matt more clearer. The young prince with whom I had just been wrestling sat to the right of me on the floor, and I explained to him that now that I had overcome him, he must read the book. But he resisted, and then he placed my arm around his shoulders, and this is Jung, I think, with his extroverted thinking, this is the fatherly Jung, and forced him with a sort of paternal kindness and patience to read the book. I knew that this was absolutely essential, and at last he yielded. Well, there is the idea that we're now really in a terrible split between in the Muslim world, for example, and the Christian world and the Judeo. You see, each Jung needs to make room for the shadow in his model, and he needs to instruct people who are he has his four function model, but so do they. That we all have to, when you get into that octagonal space, it's possible with an 8 function model to actually begin to to be inclusive, diversity and inclusion, and to show a decent amount of respect for other points of view. So there is the potential, and I really do feel when I discovered this that I must have stumbled on to the way to continue what Jung had to do. It was already seeing with psychological types in press that had to be done with typology. So I feel very happy to be a footnote to Jung's knowing that needed to happen.
You're carrying on Jung's torch that he is sending, and you really brilliantly bring the coincidence of opposites into your speech, and you're able to find all these connections among your 8 function archetype model and the octagon structure house. Yeah, and you're able to find
Octagon house.
yeah, and you continue on Jung's legacy and you build on his work
It's
through
a
all
nice
of
place to live. Look, wouldn't you like to live in a place like that? Isn't
Oh, I
that?
would totally want to, yeah.
Well, that to me is the 8 function. That's the little s self, and I think that's, if we can have that, then we'll be able to see ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a big S self?
Yes, there is, and I think that's where Jung really already gave us. He calls it the collective unconscious. He calls it the center of the collective unconscious, but it's both the center and the circumference at the same time. Um, that's the unknowable totality of everything relevant to, and what turns out to be relevant to even one's psychological life is astonishing, and the numbers of things Jung put together is a good model for the number of things we all have to put together. And so that, of course, remains bigger than all of us and still opening up to new insights and all. But we need some point of security and orientation to hold us. And I think that's where our consciousness, our types of consciousness, have a pleasing complexity. It's a complexity like it's simple, like the octagon house that you may go in through the four function model, but when you get to the eight function model, there's a kind of peace and room, and you can be, and shadow and ego can begin to make peace with each other. There's room for the both of them in that model.
Beautiful. Very Jungian of you. And so thank you for giving people that path of self-actualization through mapping out the geography of type in the way that you do. I appreciate what you bring to the type space, John. It's plentiful contributions with your parent TI that's able to help refine people's logic. And yeah, what you offer really impacts people, and it's really able to make a positive impact on the typology space. And we're glad to have you to give more light to the relationship between the ego and the shadow in all of us, and to help us understand the unconscious more through your work. Thank you,
You're a
everyone.
wonderful interviewer, Joyce. I want to thank you. You waited a long time for me, and I have to say you were so worth waiting for me, because this was the right time for us to talk.
Absolutely. Perhaps this is also a coincidence that was very pleasant and meant to happen too. So at the right time. So thank you. And I'll see you all in the next video. Bye.
Very good. All best.